New Research Performance Directions in Premodern Disability Studies. Visible logos on this title slide include the sponsors: Folger Institute at the Folger Shakespeare Library, Emory University, and Folger Shakespeare Library, Advancing Knowledge and the Arts. In early March 2021, this virtual seminar welcomed scholars, theater makers, and all those interested in disability studies. Experts in early modern disability studies and disability performance studies investigated how writers, performers, and scholars have, then and now, understood, experienced, and responded to body-mind differences. The following are excerpts from this seminar's opening roundtable, which centered intersectional approaches, public humanities work, and activist performance possibilities. Allison P. Hobgood, Willamette University.
We conceived of today's roundtable as an opportunity for our speakers to talk about how they understand the stakes and impact of the field of pre-modern disability studies. They'll discuss the ways disability studies work intersects with public activism and also equity initiatives. They'll illuminate the important confluences of disability and race. They'll examine the robust possibilities of pre-modern drama in contemporary performance. They'll show how cultural and literary histories can be used for contemporary consciousness raising and for social justice work. Today, we'll glean how especially urgent and timely disability studies is in this particular moment, and we'll learn about all the vibrant, diverse shapes that it might take.
Disability Justice Past and Present: The Power of Studying and Staging Disability for Our Own Time. Racial Intolerance in Shakespeare as it Relates to Disability. Justin Shaw, Clark University.
When I started thinking about how to center Black disabled people in early modern literature, the first thing I had to do was locate them. English writers in the 16th and 17th centuries weren't keen about such characters, or were they? The problem with depictions of Black and brown people in such texts is that they're almost always marginalized, silenced, disciplined, and/or killed. In Shakespeare alone, we might think of Caliban, Caliban, in The Tempest, who is called deformed. He is beaten and chastised, and that's after his land is stolen. Or we might recall the aged Jewish Shylock, Shylok, in The Merchant of Venice, who is forced to bear the burden of white Christians who ridicule him with racist tropes, targeting his body and behaviors, divest him of his fortune, and then force him to convert. Shakespeare calls that a comedy. Without going into a discussion of the metaphorical implications of Blackness as a kind of disabled embodiment to the white imagination, all we need to do is open up to neurodiversity to see how oppression further works against Black characters in Shakespeare's world. Othello is the most prominent early modern literary text about race, but it is also a showcase of early modern neurodiversity and thus demonstrates how these ideas are implicated in one another. But this takes away from what is clearly happening in the text itself, what critics and playgoers will not rectify: the triply oppressed enigma of a Black and disabled Moor. But that doesn't mean he is not deserving of the attention disability scholars give to magnanimous figures like Richard III, for example, or the care we allow the grieving and despondent Hamlet. Don't we care about Othello too? Isn't he allowed the space to grieve, to cry, to plead, to breathe? Or does the limit of his Black life mattering stop at his complexion? So here we are in March of 2021. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Elijah McClain, all dead. Jacob Blake is critically injured. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Millions around the world have died or suffered greatly from the COVID-19 pandemic and from increasingly frequent and catastrophic natural disasters. What does it mean to care in 2021? Where is the Othello in your network? What can you do, not to speak for him, but to speak with him, to elevate his voice and needs above your own? Whiteness and able-bodiedness or able-mindedness go hand in hand.
Intellectual intolerance in Shakespeare as it relates to disability. Stephen Unwin, director.
So I set out to discover whether there were any characters in Shakespeare who had intellectual disabilities. And I'm afraid the more I looked, the less I could find. This is partly a category error. The Elizabethans didn't recognize the condition in the modern sense, but it's striking all the same. I found myself looking at two groups. The first are figures from the lower orders who are flustered when confronted by their educated betters. A good example might be the constable Dull in Love's Labour's Lost. The name is perhaps the giveaway. In the company of a schoolteacher and a curate, Dull struggles to keep up, but his very silence encourages the two pedants to ever more extravagant boasting and intellectual disdain. In a play of vertiginous language, Dull speaks for many when he answers the concern that he has spoken no word all this while, with the one-line quip, nor understood none neither. The fact is, Dull may be dull, but he knows what he doesn't know, which is more than could be said for his betters. Indeed, his presence echoes the moral basis of the play. For when the aristocratic Bearden is told that for a 12-month day from day to day, he must visit the speechless sick and still converse with groaning wretches, we're reminded of a world beyond shallow wit-cracking. It's the world from which Dull has come and to which even the brightest of us are destined. But what's really going on here is the age-old conflation of class with intellectual disability. To the early moderns, idiot meant a person of low social standing, which casts interesting light on a tale told by an idiot in Macbeth. This is a tale told by someone of very low social standing and no property, a common player perhaps, but not someone with what we would call intellectual disability. And the second group I looked at are, of course, the fools, and I found it hard to square their supposed intellectual limitations with what they say and do in the plays. And what became clear was that the fools are in fact highly intelligent people who pretend to have intellectual disabilities so as to be able to speak freely, knowing that the moment they go too far, they can always pretend they didn't understand what they were saying.
Current applications for differently abled persons as drawn from 16th century depictions. Elizabeth B. Bearden, University of Wisconsin.
Today, I briefly consider how triage practices in the COVID crisis strip bare the eugenic logics that constitute the qualitative and quantitative medical model of disability. And I submit how early modern counter-eugenic logics and disability gain may combat these ableist assumptions and practices. At the beginning of the pandemic, many states' written triage policies were ableist and illegal and have been challenged this past year in successful lawsuits. But this means that many, many people with disabilities were denied care before the legal system could catch up. Now, if medical professionals had been reading 16th century conduct literature, much less the ethical guidelines of their own professional organizations, they might think twice before assuming that disabled people lead inferior lives. In chapter 1 of my most recent book, Monstrous Kinds, I trace the counter-eugenic logic that Giraldi Cinthio explores in his Tre Dialogi, or Three Dialogues, against the ancient practices of killing disabled infants and excluding disabled adults from full participation in society. Giraldi insistently articulates disability gain and defends people with disabilities. He says, for instance, quote, "Though children be born weak, crooked, misshapen, or deformed of body, they are not therefore to be exposed, but as well to be brought up and instructed as the others, that they may grow and increase in virtue and become worthy of those dignities which are dispensed in their commonweals," close quote. And I'm citing the 1607 translation of Giraldi by Lodowick Brisket. It turns out that our medical system might have taken a cue from the 16th century to avoid qualifying disabled lives as inferior. But all hospitals have to do is take a cue from insurance companies to evade this whole triage language problem with, wait for it, metrics. The problem of triage scoring and algorithms remains. If crisis standards of care, AKA triage policies, dock people's scores for conditions that increase chance of death within 5 years, they exclude many people whose conditions may be based in inequity without consideration of their social situations or identities. In other words, calculating life expectancy may seem more objective than qualifying quality of life, but this call is still based in bias. And in fact, it is historically based in the slave trade.
Segregation and community in the pre-modern period. Jonathan Shu, Institute for Advanced Study.
As a QPOC, historian of medieval literature, I'm interested in how modern people embrace the past to create new kinds of kinship and community and build better futures. So there can be more to be said about what medievalists can add to these conversations. I'll just flag that what we can do now during the pandemic is to think about the prehistory of the ghetto as a racialized space of disease control. This goes back to the Middle Ages, especially the first bubonic plague pandemic of the 14th century. The ghetto originally referred to a segregated Jewish space in pre-modern cities. Cultural historians, Jewish American, Black American, and Asian American have all shown how a discourse of the ghetto in public policy discourses has long harmed racialized minority groups, each with their own histories of segregation, producing new forms of disability in the process. So today, Black and Asian solidarities can offer new ways of addressing our two pandemics of anti-Asian xenophobia, as well as anti-Black policing. I don't want us to segregate the pre-modern past from our present moment, but to think together about socio-political bonds across time. A queer touch or generous beholding, as Allison has argued, Carolyn Dinshaw has argued, and our co-panelist, Rosemarie Garland Thompson, has argued as well. Let's multiply our frames of access to the past and continuously reevaluate our present.
Shakespeare in performance for disabled persons. Laura Cole, Atlanta Shakespeare Company.
In the theater community in Atlanta, probably in other places, the phrase has been for a long time, Shakespeare is for everybody. No, it's not. It's not. There's plenty of people in the world who don't need it, don't want it, don't know about it. It's not a thing, or it's ruined something in them or for them, especially, I don't know, in 6th grade or 8th grade. I think Shakespeare is for everybody. Shakespeare performance, playing with Shakespeare, clearly the study of Shakespeare and is huge. So we say Shakespeare and 4-year-olds. It's astounding. Shakespeare and 5th graders in a workshop. The only limits we place on it, Shakespeare and differently abled, different looking bodies on stage. For the professional world, it's simply a matter of going, no, deliberate. I'm going to be deliberate in how I create this. I'm going to be deliberate in how I cast this. I'm going to be deliberate in how I stand alongside someone as they discover it. It's a huge shift, but it's been happening. It'll keep happening for the practitioners.
The cultural impulses for differently abled persons. Rosemarie Garland Thompson, Emory University.
It seems to me that there's a paradox in the modern world now where we collectively are aiming for a future without disability. This is what medical science and technology is aiming for. And it is imagined as being a future with people who don't have disabilities. So it's imagined as a kind of neutral thing. We'll get rid of disability. But the problem is, the premise of that is that what the human variations that we think of as disabilities are not things that can be pried off of us in some way to leave some kind of a neutral subject that is non-disabled. And so what's happening, of course, is that a future without disability is also a future without people with disabilities, and that's the eugenic aspect of it. But at the very same time, we're all working toward the promise of equality, equal worth. And so we have this ironic situation now that in some ways, it's the best time for people with disabilities in terms of access to opportunities and resources, much better than the past in many ways. But at the very same time, people with disabilities are a threatened and fragile community. And so I think what we have to do is to think about how those two impulses, cultural impulses, if you will, work together in our thoughts about what we think of a CRIP future might be, or disability justice might be, or intersectional justice of some sort might be.
Folger Shakespeare Library, Advancing Knowledge and the Arts.